Hi everyone, and welcome to the second video cast of of our personality unit. We're going to continue with talking about Freud today and some of his students or followers or people who took some of his ideas. They're called neo-Freudians. All right. I know you all are very sad. You're missing my little face in the corner today, but I was having some tech issues and I wanted to get this out as soon as possible, so we'll have to make do. All right. We already talked about this a little bit in class today when we were discussing id, ego, superego, and defense mechanisms. But more specifically, I wanted to talk about how Freud thought your personality developed. So Freud believed that all adults had id, ego, superegos, but the way that your id, ego, superego developed, we talked about the fact that your parents had to do with it. Well, he's a little bit more specific than just saying your parents were involved, right? He's actually so specific in that he came up with stages that happened along the way where your parents would be involved. They're called the 5 psychosexual stages. And they're called psychosexual because they involve sexual urges, right? Each stage holds a conflict. It's usually a sexual conflict that has to be resolved before the child can move on, or they'll get stuck there and have problems in the future, right? So that's what we call it. Fixation is getting stuck in a stage, and you might continue on to the next stage, but you always have problems in this stage, so never really move on. And he believed that a lot of your personality was almost fully developed by the age of 6, and that definitely by the time you're a teenager, it's pretty much done. Okay, so the first stage is the oral stage. The second stage is anal, phallic, latency, genital. Okay, so at each stage, libido. At each stage you have a libido. Libido is like your sex drive. It's your sexual urges and instincts. So Freud believed that at the oral stage, the libido was focused or centered in the mouth. Okay, now I know that this sounds kind of silly, but really what he believed is that children derived pleasure like you would sexual pleasure, but not, kind of in that way, like a version of that, from feeding, right? So that was the task that a child had to be successful at in the oral stage. He had to learn to properly feed and get his needs met through feeding, okay, breastfeeding, bottle feeding, whatever it was. Now, if you either had too much or too little. So this is where you get what's called an oral fixation, right? We've heard that term maybe in like pop psych, you hear it like thrown around. Someone who's an oral fixation is someone who's always like biting their nails, biting on pen caps, whatever, right? And this is because Freud believed that if you somehow either got fed too much or not enough, there was an issue with your feeding, then you might develop an oral fixation where you're continually trying to work out this sexual energy in your mouth that you weren't able to properly address in the oral stage. All right, so then the next stage is the anal stage, right? And of course, we all think it's very funny, right? That that the idea that your sexual, your libido, your sexual energy was then transferred from, it went from the mouth to the anal stage, which was in your anus, right? But Freud really believed here that the task was potty training, and that children derived pleasure from the idea of being able to go and control their bowel movements, right? That it was like a task that they felt pleasure doing. It made them happy and excited to be able to have control over their bodies. Now, you could get stuck here. So either your parents tried to force you to be potty trained, right? And you weren't ready, you didn't want to be potty trained, and they stuck you in the toilet and said, you're not leaving until you're potty trained, right? And you weren't ready. Or they never made you potty train, and you were kind of allowed to do whatever you wanted, and maybe you had diapers on until you were 4 or 5 or whatever, right? They didn't really ever take the time to do it. So this kind of develops into 2 types of fixations. There's anal retentive, which is where you become very, very neat and organized, right? And then anal expulsive. And this is the idea really of what it is, right? Anal retentive is that you refuse to go to the bathroom. So your parents try to force you, make you, and you're like, no, I'm not going potty, right? And you can control that. You become really neat and controlling and kind of a control freak, right? And then anal expulsive is the opposite of that, right? So just going wherever you wanted to, not using the toilet, doing whatever, and being messy, right? As an adult, you like have your stuff everywhere and never know where anything is. All right, next stage is the phallic stage. And for Freud, this was one of the most important stages because this is where you developed your sexual identity. Okay, the libido here is now in the place where you and I come to think of our sexual energy, which is in our genitals. Even though we talked a lot about how the main sex organ is actually your brain, right? But in terms of, what most people think of, they think of sexual energy or sex drive in the libido. In the genitals. So the task here is to form your sexual identity. And what can happen is that as you develop your sexual identity, you have to go through the Oedipal or electric complex. So if you're a boy, you fall in love with your mom, right? But then your dad has your mom, right? Because they're married. So then you learn to identify and kind of mimic your dad to get your mom's attention. And that's how you learn to become a boy, right? That's how you learn your sexual identity. You match your dad to get the attention of your mom. Just the opposite for girls, electro. You're in love with your dad, so you match your mom because your mom has your dad, right? Then you learn how to be a girl. Well, of course, Freud didn't always believe that this happened very easily, so you might get stuck in the Oedipal or electric complex and develop various issues if you didn't learn to identify with the proper parent and struggle with sexual relationships your whole life. Also, he believed that little boys had something called castration anxiety, where literally you learned or you were afraid of that your dad would learn that you were like attracted to your mom and come and cut off your penis, right? And for girls, he thought that girls always had, and sorry, this shouldn't say womb envy, this should say penis envy. So womb envy is, I'm going to talk about in a minute. So he thought all girls had penis envy, and they were jealous that their dad had a penis and that they could never have one, and so they would never get over it, basically. Okay, latency. This is where, little boys and girls talk about, okay, you have cooties and whatever. Like, we only want to play with boys. Girls only. Boys rule. Girls drool. Whatever, right? So there is no libido. Your sex drive kind of takes a timeout, and you are just playing, having fun. You're playing with, kids who are the same sex as you, learning to kind of like become a member of our society and, get along with other members of your same sex, right? Boys play with boys, girls play with girls. No fixations or problems. The last stage is where you are from high school on, right? And this is the genital stage. And again, the libido is in your genitals, but this time instead of trying to figure out who you are as a boy or a girl, it's developing a mature relationship. And you can't really get stuck here because what happens is any issue you have in developing a mature relationship with a male or a female is a result of some problem